This NATO thing coming to a head with Russia, the stage has been set for this for such a long time. I mean, for those of you keeping score, Republican President George H.W. Poppy Bush's administration made verbal promises to Russia that NATO wouldn't expand, promises that they didn't intend to keep. Democratic President Bill Clinton apparently refused to pursue the opportunity to bring Russia into NATO, making them a partner instead of an adversary. Then Republican President George W. Bush invited Ukraine into NATO without actually making sure that was possible and pulled us out of a treaty that was protecting us from unrestrained nuclear war preparations. Then Democratic President Barack Obama allowed his vice president and State Department to orchestrate the overthrow of Ukraine. And then in 2018, Republican President Donald Trump terminated the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, the INF Treaty, which committed both the U.S. and Russia to reduce their nuclear arsenals, eliminate an entire category of nuclear weapons, and allow extensive on-site inspections for verification. And that whole time, through all of those administrations, Republican and Democrat, that whole time, NATO kept expanding right up to Russia's border. Like I said, this conflict didn't start this week.
I am so damn tired of being lied to. I don't think I can deny it anymore. You can't stick to your story if you think it flies. But I'm not gonna buy it anymore.
Hello, my friend, and thank you for listening to the 248th episode of Congressional Dish. I'm your host, Jennifer Briney. Today's episode is one that I wasn't intending to produce, and I wish I didn't have to, but I just didn't know how to continue on with the episode I had planned for you, which was about government funding and a few bills that became law, but I couldn't focus on that considering while I was working on the episode in the early morning of February 24th, Russia began a full-blown invasion of Ukraine, the goals and endgame of which, as of this recording on February 26th, remain unclear. Now, I definitely have things to share with you today, but it wasn't that long ago. It was only 2 months ago that I produced episode 244 called Keeping Ukraine. And more so than in other episodes, like a lot of times I'll suggest an episode and be like, maybe you should listen to this first for some context. Probably for the first time in Congressional Dish history, Congressional Dish number 244, Keeping Ukraine, is a prerequisite for the episode I'm going to produce for you today. There's a lot of history there that is largely unknown in the American public, although in the last week, a lot more people are talking about it, which is kind of refreshing to see. But there's a really important context there, especially in the first half of the episode, that if you're not caught up on it, then you're not going to understand where I'm coming from in this episode. You're not going to understand the context, which is so important to understand for what you're going to hear. So please stop listening to this episode right now if you haven't heard it already, and please listen to at least the first half, giving you the historical context of what happened in Ukraine in 2014. You need to hear that in order to really understand this episode. Again, that's episode 244, Keeping Ukraine. It is required before you listen to this one. But since the invasion happened, I've gotten a lot of messages, and I've been obsessed with following the updates on the war on Twitter. And I have noticed some frustrating themes in the commentary. One of the most frustrating themes are all of the hot takes about what Putin wants. There's so many armchair experts trying to get in the mind of Vladimir Putin, who's been portrayed as some kind of evil cartoon character, at least in the United States. And the thing is that I get it. The man just launched a full-blown war against his next-door neighbor that was not in any way threatening to attack him or his country. The war that he launched is unjustified, illegal, and wrong, and we're all trying to figure out what Putin wants so that we can see how this could possibly end. And I'm right there with you. I understand these sentiments. Unfortunately, when we look to our leaders, serious answers are not to be found amongst the current leadership in our Congress. So, for example, here's the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, on February 23rd.
What is this about? The people of and many of us have visited Ukraine and have seen that they love democracy. They do not want to live under Vladimir Putin. He does not want the Russian people to see what democracy looks like, and therefore he wants to bring them under his domain and his domain.
That's the kind of simplistic, ideological garbage that we're getting from the people that we've elected to guide us through events like these. No specifics, no nuance, just ideology. And so since our leaders won't be straight with us about what prompted this invasion and our role in it, I went straight to the source. I went to Vladimir Putin himself. Now, me and Pooty Poots were not friends, but the thing is that he did give an hour-long speech to the world. He did speak to us. He did try to put his perspective out there. And because no one can possibly explain what he wants from this war better than he can, because there's really only one person that can stop the invasion that he launched, and that's him, that's why I went to his own words to figure out what the fuck he's doing. Because he did tell the world what he wants in that speech. He was surprisingly specific. And while there are a few sound clips making the rounds on social media from that speech, they are all very short, and some of them are wildly out of context with the rest of his speech. And so today I'm going to share with you what I consider to be the most illustrative parts of his speech, the parts that explain to me from the man himself what he's thinking and what he wants. And I want to share this with you because our country is definitely involved in this conflict. In fact, we're in the middle of it, and we have been for far longer than the last few months. And as United States citizens, we have direct access lines to our elected officials, or at least they're supposed to answer to us. And so by examining what Vladimir Putin himself said he wants, I feel like we can be more educated when watching the developments and when judging whether what our leaders are advocating for in our names makes any sense. And I want to be honest with you, I'm already regretting producing this episode. Not because I think the information is unimportant. In fact, I'm doing this because I know it is. But just from like a personal standpoint, I just know what's coming my way by giving you clips of Vladimir Putin. I'm sure that by even this point in this episode, just from hearing the topic and the fact that I'm going to play his words on this show, someone has probably already fired me for being a Putin apologist or Russian sympathizer or whatever. Emotions right now are running so high. And even suggesting that Vladimir Putin at any time ever may have had a reasonable concern is being treated by many as blasphemy. And so I want to be very clear with you. I'm sharing this information with you because I know the corporate media is not. I'm in a hotel in Portugal this week, and I am blessed with news stations from all over the world. I have news coming at me from Britain, France, Germany, Qatar, Japan, Hong Kong, and I do have access to CNN. I've spent the last 4 days obsessively watching them all. I know that when the topic of what does Putin want comes up, you're not hearing from Vladimir Putin himself, but instead you're hearing from spooks turned commentators like proven liar James Clapper, who are giving you guesses about what's going on in the mind of the man who started the war. Well, I want you to hear from the primary source. I want you to hear from the actual man instead. That's my motivation here, to help you understand what Putin actually said. And I think it'll be easier for you to understand because I've edited it so that the translation is easier to listen to. And I'm going to add some needed context to really understand what he was talking about. My goal here is examination. So please, I'm begging you, do not equate examination with endorsement. By listening to the man, I am not in any way justifying what he has done. And so let me be as clear as I possibly can. The violence that Vladimir Putin is subjecting the citizens of Ukraine to is wrong, illegal, and unjustified. Russia was not under any kind of immediate threat. Vladimir Putin is the aggressor here. I 100% unequivocally condemn the war, and I want it to stop right fucking now. Which is why I want to understand him. I want to understand as best I can so I can understand how best to end this war right fucking now. And we Americans do have a role to play. Our country is at the center of this conflict. The real conflict is much bigger than Ukraine. And the Ukrainians, all of them, are victims who are stuck in the middle of it. And like all wars, this will end when the global elites decide it will end. Wars always end either at the negotiating table or after one side suffers a total defeat. And Ukraine is outgunned. Despite the billions of dollars worth of weapons that we have flooded the country with, they are outgunned. The odds are not in their favor. And so negotiation is Ukraine's best shot of ending this sooner than later. And so we need to listen to the other side in order to effectively negotiate. And I'm positive that there are things that Vladimir Putin told the world that you haven't heard. He told us what his problem is. He told us what he wants. And today we will listen. And from there, you can draw whatever conclusions you want. And if you have feelings that you want to share, please direct them at the Biden administration and Congress. Please remember that this podcaster has no power over this situation whatsoever. And trying to convince me of anything is a total waste of your time and energy. They have the power. Please direct your anger at them. Okay, so big picture, Ukraine is 100% a victim caught in the middle of a battle between economic systems. Right now, the world is clearly cracking into two amongst these lines. On one side are the countries that are disciples of the free market economy, which is administered via the laws created by trade agreements and governed by the World Trade Organization. I call these countries the World Trade System countries, and the United States is the leader of them and the main military defender of the system. On the other side are all the countries that are governing their economies using other laws, using other rules. They are the countries that are not assimilating into the market economy. They are the countries that are not changing their economic laws to allow private companies to operate freely, to own and profit from the land, people, and resources in their territories. These are the countries that often have companies owned by their government. They have so-called state-owned enterprises, which use the business revenues as their taxes. The countries that are resisting the global dominance of the market economy include Russia, China, Belarus, Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, Syria, countries that are right now either openly siding with Russia in this war or refusing to denounce them for it. This is the real war, the war over who will control the flow of money around the world. The Ukrainian people are simply the victims stuck in the middle of it, victims blessed and cursed with fertile land, fossil fuels, and an existing fossil fuel transportation network that has made their country a target for profit seekers forever. The war that we're witnessing right now is on a smaller level, a micro level. It's a dramatic escalation of a war in Ukraine that actually began in 2014. Now, since you already listened to Congressional Dish 244, Keeping Ukraine, you know the relevant recent history. You know that Ukraine's president in 2013, Viktor Yanukovych, pulled out of a trade agreement at the last minute that would have assimilated Ukraine into the World Trade System, an agreement that would have given Ukraine much needed cash in return for the government changing their economic laws as the International Monetary Fund, which is the loan shark of the World Trade System, as they were demanding Ukraine do. At the last minute, like a week before they were supposed to sign it, after playing the World Trade System and Russia off of each other, the Ukrainian president, Viktor Yanukovych, pulled a head fake and partnered economically with Russia instead. And that move set in motion a replacement of his government over the next few months, which was 2 years before the end of his democratically elected term. This event is known as Maidan, which is named after the square in Kiev where protesters gathered to protest his decision to pull out of the trade agreement with the World Trade System, and where violence ensued that was used to justify the coup. Now, in episode 244, you heard the evidence and why I call it a coup. It was orchestrated, not entirely, but with extensive assistance. by members of the Obama-Biden administration, specifically State Department official Victoria Nuland and then Vice President Joe Biden. They handpicked the people who would lead the new government in Ukraine, and those leaders immediately signed the trade agreement, started enacting the changes to the laws that were being demanded and still are being demanded by the International Monetary Fund, and they started selling off the companies that the Ukrainian government owned to the private sector. Immediately after the replacement of that government, the Ukrainians in the eastern part of the country, the citizens who voted overwhelmingly for Yanukovych and who saw that other countries were involved in the replacement of his government, well, they were pissed. And since 2014, Ukrainians who supported and voted for the Yanukovych government, the people who wanted to economically partner with Russia instead of the World Trade System countries, they have been fighting against the World Trade System partnered Ukrainian government in an area in East Ukraine known as the Donbass. Russia has been sending weapons to the people who supported the overthrown government, and the United States has been sending weapons and money, shitloads of it, to the Ukrainian government. Using those weapons, the Ukrainians have been fighting each other in the Donbass neighborhoods for 8 years. And 14,000 Ukrainians have died in the war, about 80% of them on the Russian side of the fight, according to the United Nations. In 2015, the entire world agreed on how that civil war should end. The agreement was that the Donbass region, where all the fighting has been taking place, should not and would not be under the total control of the Ukrainian government. While it would remain a part of Ukraine, it would officially be granted some independence, kind of like the states here in America have some independence from the federal government and get to do things their own way. And when I say the entire world agreed upon that deal, a deal known as the Minsk Agreement, I'm not exaggerating. It was approved unanimously by the United Nations, which includes Russia. But the terms of the deal never actually went into effect. The Ukrainian government was supposed to change their constitution to guarantee the independent status of the Donbass region in writing, but 7 years later, that hasn't been done. And there have been no elections in the Donbass to pick their leaders. And for 7 years, more and more Ukrainians have died. Again, the vast majority of them on the Russian side of the fight. The Ukraine war didn't start this week. It started in 2014. What changed this week is that Russia got off the sidelines. So first, in his speech, which took place on February 21st, why did Vladimir Putin say that a civil war in Ukraine mattered to his country at all?
Once again, I would like to underscore that Ukraine is not just a neighboring country to us. It is an inherent part of our own history, culture, spiritual space. They are our comrades, relatives, not only colleagues, friends, but also our family, people we have blood and family ties with.
And here's what he said the situation in Ukraine is now.
In reality, everything comes down to the fact that the collapse of the Ukrainian economy goes along with robbing the Ukrainian people, and Ukraine itself is now being controlled from the outside. It is perpetrated not only by the instructions from the West, but also locally by a network of foreign consultants, NGOs and other institutions deployed in Ukraine. They have direct influence on all the important decisions at all the levels of government, from the central down to the municipal. It influences the main state corporations, Ukrainian railways, energy complex, Ukrainian post, administration of the seaports of Ukraine. And Ukraine doesn't have independent court system anymore. The Kyiv authorities gave the preferential right to choose the members of the supreme legislation court bodies. And via its embassy in the U.S., the embassy of the U.S. directly controls the National Agency on Preventing Corruption, National Anti-Corruption Bureau, Specialized Anti-Corruption District Attorney Office, and Anti-Corruption Court. It's all done under the pretense to increase the efficiency of fighting corruption. Well, okay then, but where are the results? Because corruption is still there. It's even worse than it was. Do Ukrainians know about these choices? Do they understand that Their country has become not even a protectorate, now it's a colony with puppets at its helm. The privatization of the state has led to the fact that the authorities that call themselves the authorities of patriots doesn't have the interest of the nation.
Now, I don't know if all of that is true, but while he was saying that, I was having some flashbacks while listening to him make these accusations of puppetry and a lack of sovereignty in Ukraine. I'm flashing back to the National Endowment for Democracy episode, where we learned about this shady State Department-funded organization that funnels money to NGOs in foreign countries. The National Endowment for Democracy, where Victoria Nuland worked during the Trump years. The National Endowment for Democracy, which when I searched their website last night, was showing over $22 million worth of grants being sent to groups in Ukraine, but which today has disabled their search function. I'm also flashing back to Congressional Dish 244, which you just listened to, where I found the website of the State Property Fund of Ukraine, which is operating the sale of some of Ukraine's largest government-owned companies, which advertises its partnership with USAID right on its website. Or at least it did when the website was working. Good thing I grabbed a screenshot, which I will put in the show notes for you. And I'm flashing back to Joe Biden himself bragging to other global elites in 2018 about his personal influence over the Ukrainian judicial system.
And I had gotten a commitment from Poroshenko and from Yatsenyuk that they would take action against the state prosecutor, and they didn't. So they said they were walking out to press conference. I said, no, I said, I'm not going to, or we're not going to give you the $1 billion. They said, you have no authority. You're not the president. The president said. I said, call him. I said, I'm telling you, you're not getting the $1 billion. I said, you're not getting the $1 billion. I'm going to be leaving here. And I think it was, 6 hours? I looked, I said, I'm leaving in 6 hours. If the prosecutor's not fired, you're not getting the money. Well, son of a bitch. Got fired. And they put in place someone who was solid at the time.
Now, I don't have time to research all of his claims. And the Ukrainian government websites are under cyber attack right now, so I probably couldn't really research all of them if I tried. But his claims, based on what I've seen over the years with my own eyes and ears, those claims are not wild accusations. They are not all wrong. And this accusation simply can't be denied.
We cannot help but react to this real threat, especially since I would like to reiterate that there are Western backers. They can help Ukraine with getting this weapon to create yet another threat for our country, because we can see how consistently they are pumping Ukraine with weapons. The United States alone, starting from 2014, transferred billions of dollars, including the arms supply, training, personnel. In recent months, Western weapons are sent to Ukraine ceaselessly in front of the eyes of the entire world.
And here's Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs Victoria Nuland testifying to Congress less than 2 months ago on December 7th.
Since 2014, the United States has provided Ukraine with $2.4 billion in security assistance, including $450 million this year alone.
And here's President of the United States Joe Biden about a week ago in his speech delivered to the world on February 18th.
This past year, the United States provided a record amount of security assistance to Ukraine to bolster its defensive, $650 million from Javelin missiles to ammunition. We also previously provided $500 million in humanitarian aid and economic support for Ukraine. And earlier this week, we also announced an additional sovereign loan guarantee of up to $1 billion to strengthen Ukraine's economic resilience.
You know, you can call a weapon defensive all you want, but a weapon is a weapon. A weapon can kill. And, you know, the whole reason that I know anything about this is that right after the 2014 coup, Congress passed and President Obama signed a law funneling money and weapons to Ukraine. You know, President Trump was impeached for even suggesting that he might cut off the weapons flow. The steady stream of weapons has not been hidden. In fact, it's been quite the opposite. They've been saber-rattling against Russia with these weapons transfers the whole time. But the thing is that this is bigger than just the U.S. Vladimir Putin spent damn near half of his hour-long speech focused on threats he perceived from NATO. Now, NATO stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which was created in 1949 after the end of World War II. And at the same time that the victors of the World War decided that there should be one global economic system to rule the world, and that global order would guarantee peace. Or at least that's what they said. Now, NATO was expressly created in order to protect its European members from possible aggression from the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union had its own military alliance known as the Warsaw Pact. But the Soviet Union stopped being a thing in the beginning of the 1990s, before, Britney Spears was even on the Disney Channel. And yes, I punctuate time based on Britney Spears' career. Who doesn't? But we were babies! And after the Soviet Union broke up, so did its Warsaw Pact military alliance. But NATO remained. And so the purpose of NATO ever since the breakup of the Soviet Union has been debatable and in fact debated. Now, NATO argues that it exists purely as a defensive organization. But NATO overthrew the government of Libya in 2011, a country that was not threatening a member of NATO or anyone else for that matter. Libya was in the middle of a civil war, and NATO overthrew the government. The details are different, but it's essentially what Russia is trying to do to Ukraine right now in response to Ukraine's internal civil war. If it's unjustified aggression when Russia does it, which I think it is, then it's unjustified aggression when NATO does it, which I think it was. But the point is that NATO cannot credibly be labeled as purely defensive. And Vladimir Putin has apparently seen some of the same documents that I have.
There will be a bigger threat of immediate attack against our country. In American strategic documents, their doctrine, there is such a possibility of preventive work against the missile complexes of the adversary. And who is the main adversary of the United States? We all know that, Russia. In NATO documents, our country is officially directly called a main threat to the North Atlantic security. And Ukraine will serve as the platform for such an offense.
And it is true that NATO keeps identifying Russia as a reason for its existence, as a reason for it to keep building up its military presence. So, for example, in NATO's 2020 annual report, under the heading Deterrence, Defense, and Dialogue, there's a whole section on Russia alone, which is the only country treated to such attention. Now, considering that Russia has a large percentage of the world's nuclear weapons, the attention is warranted, but it is clear that NATO considers Russia an adversary, not a partner, even before his invasion of its neighbor. And for this reason, Russia, since the fall of the Soviet Union, has been making it crystal clear that they wanted and expected a buffer zone between NATO and its borders. And they were led to believe that there would be one. Georgetown University has collected an excellent archive of documents proving that the Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev was promised that NATO wouldn't expand after the Soviet Union fell. For example, there's a document proving that on February 9, 1990, U.S. Secretary of State James Baker promised Gorbachev during their meeting that NATO did not intend to expand. First, he agreed with Gorbachev's statement in response to the assurances that, quote, NATO expansion is unacceptable, unquote. And then, promising in even clearer terms, Secretary of State Baker assured Gorbachev that, quote, it is important to have guarantees that if the United States keeps its presence in Germany within the framework of NATO, not an inch of NATO's present military jurisdiction will spread in an eastern direction, unquote. But here's the thing. The assurances made verbally were not made legally binding in writing. Now, some will argue, and in fact they are, that the fact that it wasn't in writing means that the promises didn't matter. But that's playground diplomacy. It's like, ha, you didn't get it in writing, sucker. You know, the fact is that promises were made, they were reasonably believed, and then they were broken. And bitterness about that still remains to this day, whether we agree that they should be bitter or not.
You only need to look at the map to see how did the Western countries keep their word about non-expansion of NATO eastwards. They just lied to us. We had 5 waves of NATO expansion. In 1999, Poland, Czech Republic, Hungary were joined NATO in 2004, Bulgaria, Estonia, Lithuania, Slovakia, Romania, and Slovenia in 2009, Albania and Croatia in 2017, Montenegro, and 2020, North Macedonia. As a result, the alliance's military infrastructure is drawn really close to the borders of Russia. That's one of the reasons, of the key reasons of the security crisis. It affected the entire system of international relations. The mutual trust was lost. The situation continues to get worse in strategic area as well. In Romania and in Poland, as part of the U.S. project, they deploy anti-missile defensive systems. We all know that the launchers deployed there can be used for cruise missiles Tomahawk. That is a strike weapon, strike system. And USA is also developing Standard 6 missile. It can not only be used as an anti-missile defensive tool, it can strike at targets on land and on the sea. So they are expanding their infrastructure and they get new offensive capabilities. From the information that we get, we have every reason to believe that further deploying the sites, the facilities of North Atlantic Treaty Organization, this decision has already been made. That's just a matter of time. We understand clearly that under this scenario, the level of military threat for Russia will be increased manifold.
So he said the decision to welcome Ukraine into NATO has already been made. But is Ukraine actually going to join NATO? Because Germany and France in particular have never really gotten on board with the idea because they knew that it was pissing Russia off. And unlike in the United States, where we are thousands of miles away, Germany and France, you can drive to Russia from there. But, you know, the promise was made that Ukraine could join NATO by the person that I consider the worst president of my lifetime, George W. Bush, whose administration by the time he left office had promised Ukraine that it could join NATO, but didn't actually do any of the details like setting a timeline or figuring out a realistic pathway to make it happen. So W basically invited Ukraine into the club as he raced out the door to go home and paint weird pictures of his feet and let everyone else deal with the fallout. George W. Bush, I should also mention, also pulled us out of the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, which is the ABM Treaty, which was a treaty between the U.S. and the Soviet Union that limited the number of missile delivery systems each side could have, which is one of the reasons why the situation now is so fucking dangerous. The number of missile delivery systems aimed at both our countries has been effectively unlimited for over 20 years now. You know, the negative consequences of the George W. Bush presidency, they just don't stop. But back to the invitation to NATO that W gave to Ukraine, Vladimir Putin, who has been in power now for over 2 decades, well, he was president of Russia at the time, and predictably, he was pissed. However, the tension over this simmered during the early Obama years because Ukraine's president, Viktor Yanukovych, well, he officially abandoned the goal of joining NATO in June of 2010. But then, as you already know, in 2014, Viktor Yanukovych was officially thrown out on his ass, and the slow roll welcome of Ukraine into NATO was back on. At least in theory. Like I said, Germany and France have never been fully on board. And if anyone votes no, the new country can't join the alliance. And so NATO officially adding Ukraine was and certainly is far, far from certain. And it definitely wasn't happening anytime soon, so it definitely can't be used to justify a full-blown invasion of Ukraine to stop it. But here's what Vladimir Putin said about the reality that NATO membership for Ukraine was not an imminent threat. And by the way, in this clip, he's going to mention OSCE, which stands for the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which has 57 members. It's a security alliance. It's not really an alliance. They don't guarantee anything militarily, but it's a membership organization that has 57 members, including Russia.
Some NATO members still skeptical about Ukraine joining NATO. And from some European capitals, we get a signal. They are saying, so what are you worrying about? It's not going to happen tomorrow. And now our American counterparts are saying the same. We say, okay, it is not going to happen tomorrow, but the day after tomorrow then. What will it change in historical context? Nothing. More than that, we know the stance and the statements of the U.S. leadership about the active confrontation military actions in the east of Ukraine would not stop Ukraine to join NATO if it will correspond to the criteria of the NATO Charter and if they can overcome corruption. And they try to convince us that NATO is a peaceful and defensive bloc, so there is no threat for Russia. And they, again, suggest we believe their words. But we already know the value of such words. Back in 1990, when we talked about uniting Germany, the USA promised to the Soviet leadership that neither jurisdiction nor military presence would not move an inch to the east, and unification of Germany would not lead to the eastward expansion of NATO. And I'm quoting here. So they were saying all these things, they were giving us assurances, but these were just words later. They started saying that Central European and Eastern European countries joining NATO will improve their relations with Moscow, will rid these countries from the fears of their difficult historical legacy, and more than that, it will allow them to create this belt of the friendly nations. But it was the other way around. These states are now bringing their stereotypes, their complexes of the Russian threat to NATO. They insisted on increasing potential of collective security that was supposed to be deployed against Russia, first of all. And it was happening back in the 1990s and early 2000s when, because of the openness and goodwill, our goodwill, relations between Russia and the West were at high levels. Russia fulfilled all its obligations. We withdrew troops from Germany, from the Central and Eastern European countries, and it made a huge contribution in overcoming the legacy of the Cold War. We consistently suggested all kinds of cooperation, including in the format of the Russian NATO Council and OSCE. More than that, I will say one thing that I have never said before in public. I will say it for the first time. Back in 2000, when President Bill Clinton was visiting Moscow at the end of his term, I asked him, how would America see Russia joining NATO? I would not give you all the details of that conversation, but the reaction to my conversation looked, well, very reserved, let me put it this way. And how did Americans really look at this possibility? You can see it in their practical steps in regard of our country, open support of the terrorists in North Caucasus, ignoring our demands and our concerns in the security area, withdrawing from the treaties, arms treaties, and so on and so forth.
This NATO thing coming to a head with Russia, the stage has been set for this for such a long time. I mean, for those of you keeping score, Republican President George H.W. Poppy Bush's administration made verbal promises to Russia that NATO wouldn't expand, promises that they didn't intend to keep, which the Georgetown University documents in the show notes prove that too. Democratic President Bill Clinton apparently refused to pursue the opportunity to bring Russia into NATO, making them a partner instead of an adversary. Then Republican President George W. Bush invited Ukraine into NATO without actually making sure that was possible and pulled us out of a treaty that was protecting us from unrestrained nuclear war preparations. Then Democratic President Barack Obama allowed his vice president and State Department to orchestrate the overthrow of Ukraine. And then, this is relevant to the next clip I'm going to play for you, in 2018, Republican President Donald Trump terminated the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, the INF Treaty, which committed both the U.S. and Russia to reduce their nuclear arsenals, eliminate an entire category of nuclear weapons, and allow extensive on-site inspections for verification. And that whole time, through all of those administrations, Republican and Democrat, that whole time, NATO kept expanding right up to Russia's border. Like I said, this conflict didn't start this week. Here's Vladimir Putin on the eve of his invasion of Ukraine.
Many Ukrainian airfields are positioned close to our borders, and strategic NATO airplanes using high-precision weapons can strike targets in Volgograd, Samar, and Kazan and Astrakhan. Using reconnaissance tool will allow NATO to control the airspace of Russia up until the Urals. And finally, after the U.S. withdrew from the INF Treaty, the Pentagon has openly started developing a whole range of the land-based missiles with a range of 5,500 kilometers. If such systems are deployed in Ukraine, they can hit the targets in the European Russia and also behind the Urals. And the travel time of the Tomahawk missiles to Moscow will be less than 35 minutes. Ballistic missiles, 7-8 minutes. And the hypersonic offensive weapons, 4-5 minutes. That's like having a knife against our throat. And I have no doubt they plan to implement these ideas. And as it has been done previously when they expanded NATO to the east, moving infrastructure, military infrastructure closer to our borders, ignoring our protests and our warnings, they just didn't care about that. They did whatever they deemed necessary and appropriate. And I believe they plan to continue doing like that.
I would be pretty concerned if I had missiles that close to my country too. And while we're on the topic of weapons, let's not forget that both sides here have nuclear weapons. And there was a development last week that I think has gone largely unknown in the United States. Last week, there was a conference in Munich, Germany, where Ukraine's President Vladimir Zelensky gave an impassioned speech. And I'm going to play you a clip from his speech, but first you need to know some history to understand the significance of what he's about to say. At the end of 1994, the leaders of Ukraine, Russia, Britain, and the United States signed the Budapest Memorandum, which got Ukraine to agree to eliminate its nuclear arsenal in return for Russia, the United States, and Britain guaranteeing Ukraine's security. Now, obviously, Russia is not upholding their end of that bargain, not only because they are literally trying to overthrow Ukraine's government right now, but because the agreement required all parties to respect the boundaries of Ukraine, which Russia obviously didn't do when they took control of Crimea after the 2014 coup. But the United States and the UK, allies of this Ukrainian government, well, we are apparently legally required to guarantee Ukraine's security if Ukraine remains nuclear weapon free. Well, Vladimir Zelensky said this to an audience full of global leaders in a speech that was also televised around the world. This was from February 19th.
The fact that we refused from the third biggest nuclear power, we received the security guarantees. We are no longer have that weapon. Neither do we have the security. Since 2014, 3 times Ukraine has tried to call for consultations for the guarantors of the countries who guaranteed the Budapest Agreement. 3 times, no success. This will be the 4th time today that we're going to do this. As a president, for the first time. But both Ukraine and me will do this the last time. We are initiating under Budapest Memorandum, call for and ask the foreign minister to have this meeting. And if, as a result of this, we're not going to guarantee of defense after this summit, we will think that Budapest Memorandum is not working, and all the package decisions of 1994 have been put in question and compromised.
And here's Vladimir Putin's thoughts on that statement on the eve of his invasion 2 days later.
We also heard statements about Ukraine wanting to create their own nuclear weapon. And that's not just idle threat. Ukraine really has nuclear technology and carriers to deliver such weapons back from the Soviet times. And they have Tochka-U launchers, also designed in the Soviet Union. It has range of more than 100 kilometers, and they can increase that. It's a matter of time. They still have this technology from the Soviet times. So getting tactical nuclear weapon will be much easier for Ukraine than for certain other states. I'm not going to list them that are now researching this, especially if they have technological support from abroad.
Now, obviously, that's not an imminent threat. You can't just whip up a nuclear weapon. So this doesn't justify this war in any way. And Joe Biden did try to make that basic point to Putin in his February 15th in his internationally televised address, which, by the way, every time Biden speaks, it's been aired live on every news station here in Europe. And I have to assume that's also happening around the world. But here's what Biden said.
The United States and NATO are not a threat to Russia. Ukraine is not threatening Russia. Neither the U.S. nor NATO have missiles in Ukraine. We do not have plans to put them there as well.
But even if that's true, which I have no cause to doubt, here's Vladimir Putin's side of the argument.
The activities of the Ukrainian army is governed by the foreign consultants, and we are well aware of that. Last year, under the pretext of the war games, the military contingents of the NATO countries were deployed in Ukraine. The Ukrainian army is already integrated into NATO. It means that Ukrainian army units can be done directly from the NATO headquarters. The West started to explore the territory of Ukraine as the future theater of military action, as the future battlefield, and it is aimed against Russia. Last year alone, it had more than 20,000 troops and more than 1,000 equipment, hardware units. And NAPR, they have already adopted a law to allow the foreign troops to enter the territory of Ukraine to participate in the war games. And first of all, it means the NATO troops. And this year, they planned no less than 10 drills like that. And it serves as a cover to increase the NATO contingent in Ukraine, especially since the network of airfields, Borispol, Ivano-Frankovsk, Chuguyev, Odessa, and so on, it can be used to deploy troops in shortest terms. The airspace for Ukraine is open for reconnaissance and strategic planes of NATO, unmanned drones that are used to monitor the territory of Russia. And the Naval Operations Center built by the Americans in Ochakov allows NATO ships to use it as a port and allows to use high-precision weapons against Black Sea Navy and our entire infrastructure on the Black Sea coast.
Now, again, I don't know if all the details of that are true, but I do know that NATO has been doing all kinds of military exercises with the Ukrainian military. I do know that we've been training the Ukrainian military, and I do know that they are working on interoperability, which means those two forces fighting together. And that clip is one of the ones that made me decide to produce this episode, despite the shitstorm of emotional Putin bad, how dare you platform him type messages that I know are going to be coming my way. You know, I know that I'm going to get in trouble for airing the Red Devil's words, but I think he made a point that we need to hear. Like, does it matter if NATO officially welcomes Ukraine if their militaries are interoperable and NATO is allowed to use Ukrainian land and resources? Because just think about it. NATO, as things stand right now, kind of gets the best of both worlds, right? Like, NATO is allowed to use Ukraine for its drills and to station its equipment, but it doesn't have to defend Ukraine if Ukraine is attacked, as we are witnessing right now, where Ukraine is not being helped at all. But if NATO wanted to attack Russia, well, then NATO would be able to partner with the Ukrainian forces that we have been training and arming for the last 8 years, no problem. They've, in fact, been practicing for that very scenario. And so does it matter if NATO has Ukraine as an official member, if Ukraine is willing to be a partner like that?
Article 17 of the Constitution of Ukraine doesn't allow military bases of foreign states to be deployed in their territory, but it seems that it can be bypassed. They have deployed training missions of the NATO countries in Ukraine. Basically, that's a military base already. They just call it a mission, and it's done.
You know, membership or a partnership? Does it matter if the capability is there? Like military base or a mission location? Does it matter if the troops are working together on Ukrainian land? You know, the people who are looking at this more closely than the, Putin bad, NATO good people, well, the people who are, examining the nuances, they are rightfully focused on Putin's protests against NATO expansion in the lead up to the war. But is that missing the point? Because Vladimir Putin, if you bother to listen to him, was crystal clear about what he wants, and the guarantee that Ukraine not be a NATO member was only one part of it.
Last December, we have sent our partners the draft document about security guarantees and also the draft agreement on the measures of enhancing Russian security and NATO member security. In response, NATO members and the U.S. were saying a lot of words. There was some reasonable ideas, but they were talking only about secondary things. And it looked as an attempt to bring this discussion away from the main point, and we reacted in kind. I would like to emphasize that we are ready to negotiate, but only on the condition that all matters will be considered as a package in complex, without going away from the main proposals made by Russia. And those have three main items. Firstly, non-expansion of NATO to the east, non-deployment of offensive weapons next to the Russian borders, and finally, bringing back the military infrastructure back to the configuration of 1997 when the founding act was signed between Russia and NATO. These principled proposals were ignored.
So in 1997, NATO didn't include pretty much any of the former USSR countries. And so with that third demand, he's essentially saying that he wants the NATO weapons and infrastructure to be removed from the Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland, Bulgaria, Romania, Slovakia, Slovenia, Albania, Croatia, Montenegro, North Macedonia, and Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, which is where we have been building up our own United States troop presence as part of the European Deterrence Initiative. Because remember, we have a whole separate military buildup going on over there that is not even a NATO program. The European Deterrence Initiative, started as the European Reassurance Initiative, was begun in June of 2014, right after the coup in Ukraine and after Russia took over Crimea. But since that time, we have spent about $27 billion on this military buildup on Russia's border. And for fiscal year 2022, the budget request is $3.7 billion. And that's another factor here that I think that we have to bring up. Our government for 2022 still hasn't been funded yet. And it's supposed to be funded by March 11th. We'll see if that actually happens. But the next opportunity for funneling money and weapons into this situation, it's right now. And so for the request for 2022, which is still possible and it can be increased, but Biden, before all this, requested $3.7 billion, which would support about 10,000 military members in addition to the 74,000 U.S. troops that were already permanently stationed in Europe. And so if this is what he was saying in negotiations, this is what Putin was hearing from our side of the table. Our side of the table, which, by the way, has had the worst possible person sitting on it that I could possibly imagine, Victoria Nuland. She's the person that the entire world heard staffing the post-coup Ukrainian government before the coup even happened. That's the person we're sending to the negotiating table. Someone who wasn't even allowed in Russia to negotiate when she was rehired and promoted to the top of the State Department. At the time that she got the job from Joe Biden, she was sanctioned by Russia. We had to make a deal to even get her fat ass into the country. The arrogance and bad faith that our government showed, not our government, Joe fucking Biden showed, by even sending her is worth noting. And then when she got there, this is the message. This is Senator Todd Young of Indiana questioning Victoria Nuland on December 7th in Congress.
President Putin and Foreign Minister Lavrov have repeatedly indicated that they seek to deny any potential path to NATO membership for Ukraine and other Eastern European countries. Does the administration view this demand as a valid issue for negotiation?
No, we do not. And President Biden made that point crystal clear to President Putin today that the issue of who joins NATO is an issue for NATO to decide. It's an issue for applicant countries to decide, that no other outside power will or may have a veto or a vote in those decisions.
The Biden administration, with Victoria Nuland as the head negotiator, wouldn't even negotiate on the NATO membership that wasn't actually likely to happen anyway. And so how receptive and respectful of his other requests do you think that this coup plotter was while representing us at that table? And so here we are. This is pretty much Putin's bottom line.
And I want to be frank. In the current situation, when our proposals about equitable dialogue about principal matters had no response from the US and NATO, when the level of threat for our country is becoming greater and greater, Russia has every right to take countermeasures to enhance our own security. And that's how we plan to act.
And here's the announcement of war.
As for situation in Donbass, we can see that the Kiev elite keeps stating publicly about lack of willingness to implement the Minsk agreements to settle the conflict. They are not interested in peaceful resolution. Vice versa, they want to start blitzkrieg, like it happened back in 2014 and 2015. And you remember how it ended. Now almost every day they are shelling settlements in Donbass. They have amassed large troops. They are using offensive unmanned vehicles and other heavy machinery, torturing people, children, women, elderly people. It doesn't stop. It doesn't cease. We see no end to it. And the so-called civilized world and our Western colleagues proclaim themselves as the only representatives of this free world. They prefer not to notice this, as if there is nothing like this happening. There is no genocide perpetuated against almost 14 million people. And the only reason is that these people didn't want to back the coup d'etat in 2014. They stood against the nationalist movement, the movement towards nationalism, Stone Age nationalism and Nazism, and they want to defend their basic rights to live on their land, to speak their native language, to preserve their traditions and their culture. How much longer that could go on? How much longer can they bear it? Russia did everything it could to keep the territorial integrity of Ukraine. We tried hard to implement the resolution of the Security Council of UN 2202 that endorsed the Minsk agreements on resolving the situation in Donbass. But everything was done in vain. The presidents are changing, the parliament members are changing, but the idea of the aggressive regime is still the same, regime that seized the power in Kiev. It was created by the coup d'etat of 2014, and those who chose the way of violence, they admit they see no other way to resolve the Donbas crisis other than the military way. In this regard, I deem it necessary to make a decision that should have been made a long time ago, to immediately recognize the independence and sovereignty of Donetsk People's Republic and Lugansk People's Republic. And I would like to request the Federal Assembly to support, to back this decision and ratify the agreement of friendship and mutual help with both republics. We will draft this document and sign these documents in the near future.
Now, had he then rolled his tanks into the Donbass to defend it from the Ukrainian government and fight for its independence, it would have been very much illegal and wrong, but it would have made sense. You know, the Minsk agreement, agreed to by the whole world, was supposed to grant that region some independence. And it's been 7 years of people fighting and dying while waiting, so fuck it, independence by force. And I think most of the world thought that would be the extent of it. I know that I did. But then the next day, missiles were falling on the capital city of Kyiv. And as I record this, thousands of Ukrainian citizens are fighting on the streets of their capital. You know, their capital might be under the control of Russia by the time you hear this. I don't know. But that's where so many of these questions come in. Like, why is he going this far? And there's one theory that is spreading like wildfire. And that's the theory that Vladimir Putin is doing this to recreate the Soviet Union because he doesn't think Ukraine or any other Soviet country has the right to exist. And it's Putin's speech that's being quoted as the reason that people say they think this. Even the President of the United States is floating this theory. Here's Biden on February 22nd, the day after Putin's speech.
He directly attacked Ukraine's right to exist.
He indirectly threatened territory formerly held by Russia, including nations that today are thriving democracies and members of NATO. He explicitly threatened war unless his extreme demands were met. And there's no question that Russia is the aggressor.
So Russia's definitely the aggressor. We've stipulated. But I watched and read this speech twice, and now I'm, while playing it for you, listening to it again. And the only way that you can come to that conclusion is if you haven't either read or listened to the speech in full, or if you have and you are cherry-picking quotes to fit a predetermined narrative. Because that claim doesn't make any damn sense. First, the claim that Putin doesn't think Ukraine or any other Soviet Union countries have a right to exist. Here's what Vladimir Putin actually said.
I would like to start by saying that the modern Ukraine was completely created by Russia. To be more exact, by Bolshevik communist Russia. This process has started almost immediately after the 1917 revolution. And Lenin and his supporters did it in a rough way. If we talk about Russia, they were alienating parts of historical territories of Russia. And millions of people who lived there, obviously no one asked anything. Then before the Great Patriotic War and after it, Stalin added to the USSR and handed over to Ukraine some lands that belonged to Poland and Hungary. And as a compensation, Stalin gave some ancient German lands to Poland. And in the 1960s, Khrushchev decided to take Crimea away from Russia and also gave it to Ukraine. That's how the territory of the Soviet Ukraine was formed.
Vladimir Putin called the borders drawn by his Soviet predecessors arbitrary and said that they were drawn without consideration of the populations living within them. He then went on to talk about how the decision to have these sort of states in the Soviet Union, states that were allowed to secede from the Union instead of just having the USSR be like one giant country, he was saying that having those separate countries is a reason why the USSR didn't survive. And in regards to Ukraine specifically, he talks about how the borders of Ukraine fall into this category of a country whose borders were drawn without considerations of the populations by Vladimir Lenin.
And as a result of Bolsheviks' policy, the Soviet Ukraine was created. And we have every reason to say now that it's Ukraine created by Vladimir Lenin. He's its creator and architect, and it's fully confirmed by the documents from the archives, also including the Lenin's decrees regarding Donbass that was added to Ukraine.
He essentially said that Ukraine was thoughtlessly drawn and that Donbass doesn't make much sense as a part of Ukraine, which in the context of what he was going to announce at the end of the speech, that he was going to break the Donbass off of Ukraine, that makes sense. But he was not saying that Ukraine itself shouldn't exist, because he then went on to talk about how during the USSR, even though there were countries that existed on paper, again, during the USSR, he said that there was actually one government that was ruling, the communist dictatorship, and that it was unrealistic to think that they could manage such a large and diverse territory.
I would like to remind you that back in 1922, at the territory of the former Russian Empire, the Soviet Union was established. But the reality showed that keeping this territory and ruling this territory using the principles of confederation deems impossible, because it had nothing to do neither with the realities nor with the historical tradition. In reality, Soviet republics had no sovereign rights. None. In practice, what was created, strictly centralized, unitarian in its character.
Now, that clip I just played for you appears differently depending on where you read it, if you're reading it, because the translation is from Russian to English. But there are written translations where instead of Putin saying this,
in reality, Soviet republics had no sovereign rights. None.
The written translation says, quote, in reality, the Union republics did not have any sovereign rights. They simply did not exist, unquote. And that's what some lazy commentators have been pointing to when they say that Putin said that Ukraine doesn't have a right to exist. That's not what he said. He said the rights of Ukraine and other Soviet countries didn't exist during the USSR. In fact, he very clearly later in the speech acknowledges the independence of Ukraine.
Our people agreed to the new realities that were brought about by the collapse of the USSR. They recognized new states, new republics, not only recognized. Back then, Russia was in dire situation, but it tried to help its partners from the CIS, including Ukrainian partners, because starting from the moment of proclaiming independence, they started making requests for the material support. And our country was giving this support with respect to the sovereignty of Ukraine. According to the estimates of the experts, that can be proved just by looking at the prices of our energy carriers, by our loans, about trade preferences that Russia was giving to Ukraine. The total profit for the Ukrainian budget since 1991 to 2013 was about $250 billion.
And then he goes into a bunch of detail on the amount of money that Ukraine has gotten from Russia and some of the trade disputes that Russia and Ukraine have had since Ukraine became independent in 1991. But the idea that the goal of this full-blown invasion of Ukraine is to have this be like the first step in the recreation of the Soviet Union, you know, if Vladimir Putin is the source of your information about the mind of Vladimir Putin, well, it just doesn't make any sense. He said that trying to do what the Soviet Union did to try to control so much diverse territory, he said it would be, quote, impossible, unquote. And so I don't buy that his goal in all this is to really try and fail at the impossible himself. And so what is he trying to do? I don't know. But I wanted you to hear that clip because there's a lot of, oh, Ukraine is just the beginning. We're all in danger. This is a threat to all of Europe. There's a lot of that going on. And, you know, I don't know what's going to happen here. I didn't actually think he was going to invade all of Ukraine the way he has. But if you take the man at his word, which I know we're talking about Vladimir Putin here, but if you take the man at his word by actually listening to his actual words, that just doesn't seem to be what he's trying to do. And I know that that is giving me some comfort, and that's why I wanted you to hear it. But as for what is he trying to do, what is his goal, I don't know. And I know that's an unsatisfying answer, but I simply do not know. But one person for the past few months, we do have to give him credit, who seems to know things the rest of us don't know, is President Joe Biden. If there is one bit of good news in this entire show, it is that our president, who has been going out there and saying like, Putin's going to invade Ukraine to the point that it seemed a little psycho about a week ago. Well, it turns out our president isn't full of shit. So that's kind of nice. And it's also good that he is saying this. Here is President Joe Biden on February 18th.
I don't think he is remotely contemplating nuclear, using nuclear weapons. But I do think I think he is focused on trying to convince the world that he has the ability to change the dynamics in Europe in a way that he cannot.
So that's another thing I wanted you to hear so that hopefully you'll feel a little bit better. On top of that, if you've been nervous that President Biden is maybe going to get us sucked into another, 2-decade-long non-nuclear war while trying to maintain his regime change in Ukraine, well, so far he's maintaining his promised position, the position that he promised us on February 15th. And February 18th, and February 22nd, and again like yesterday, but this clip is from February 15th.
While I will not send American servicemen to fight in Ukraine, we have supplied the Ukrainian military with equipment to help them defend themselves. We provided training and advice and intelligence for the same purpose.
Now, two things about that. Number one, training and advice, those things are done by contractors. So he's promising no real military members on the ground in Ukraine, but private mercenaries are definitely on the table and probably on the ground in Ukraine. Now, private mercenaries, contractors, are still paid by your tax money. They just make a lot more than your actual military members and have a lot less accountability. But, two, even if there are contractors, refusing to send our real troops, which, 2 days into this, that promise has been maintained despite President Zelensky of Ukraine begging the world to send fighters. He's going on TV like every few hours. Well, our refusal to actually send our troops just shows how important NATO really is in this situation, because regardless of how we feel about it, after all those exercises that NATO performed with the Ukrainian military, and after any interoperability between the forces had been accomplished, NATO and the United States have completely abandoned the Ukrainians to fight off the Russians on their own. But if Ukraine were an official NATO country, they probably would not be fighting the Russians on their own. The only action the Biden administration is willing to take so far is enacting sanctions, which have been authorized by many laws passed since 2014, many of which I've outlined for you on this podcast. Essentially, sanctions are economic war tactics. They cut off people, companies, and governments from their money in the World Trade System banks, and they often make it illegal for people to do business with the companies in the sanctioned areas. But the thing about sanctions is that they only work if the targets have money in the World Trade System banks, or more accurately, if they have identifiable money in the World Trade System banks. But again, big picture, Ukraine is caught in the middle of a battle between two economic systems, and an alternative to the World Trade System is expanding more and more every day. And I think a vital piece of information that you might not have heard was announced on February 4th, when Russia signed a 30-year contract to supply fossil fuels to China. Even more significant, the gas transactions will be conducted in euros, not in dollars. And this is significant because the fossil fuel trade on the global scale in the World Trade System is conducted in dollars. That's why the United States dollar is nicknamed the petrodollar. And it's actually a key reason why our country gets away with so much of our financial fuckery around the world. Russia and China, though, are two huge countries that once again are creating new laws between them that do not match those of the World Trade System. And this move disconnects them even more from the systems that are controlled specifically by the United States. And also on that same day, China and Russia issued a joint statement saying that they both oppose the enlargement of the NATO alliance. Again, that was February 4th. And on February 22nd, President Putin said this about sanctions that Biden and the EU leaders were threatening him with. This is the night before his invasion.
Once again, they try to blackmail us. Once again, they threaten us with sanctions. And I think they will still impose those, introduce those as strong and as more powerful our country becomes. They will always find an excuse to introduce more sanctions, regardless of the situation in Ukraine, that is. The only goal they have is to contain the development of Russia.
You know, sanctions only work if the sanctioned parties have nowhere else to go for cash. The growing economic partnership with China that Russia has, in fact, the growing economic system that is running parallel to the World Trade System that is being created by China, especially through its Belt and Road Initiative, all of that blunts the effect of sanctions on Russia. You know, these sanctions are not going to work if Putin doesn't care about them. And so far, as I'm sitting here watching footage of tanks continuing to roll into Ukraine, Putin doesn't seem to care about them. Now, that said, the sanctions so far have not been the maximum sanctions that are possible, not even close. So far, the Russian fossil fuel industry, which kind of is the Russian economy, it's barely been touched. Russia also still has access to the SWIFT banking system, which is the platform that's used to carry out global financial transactions. And so as long as fossil fuels and SWIFT remain unsanctioned or even partially sanctioned, because if one country does the sanctions but the others doesn't, you can go through that avenue. So as long as there aren't blanket sanctions over fossil fuels and SWIFT remains accessible to Russia, well, that means that Russia is still very much in business. And so when I look at this whole thing we're doing right now with the sanctions, this feels like we're doing something in sanctions, but that it's essentially just for show, just for, voters who don't know what sanctions are or how they work. Basically, as of this recording, the Ukrainian people are alone in this war. I have the TV on mute in front of me as I record this right now. I'm watching BBC World. And I've been watching hundreds of Ukrainians, men, women, children, working together to create box after box of Molotov cocktails, which in other countries, in other situations, we have branded those as terrorist weapons. And just to be clear, I'm not calling Ukrainians terrorists by any means. I didn't call Iraqis terrorists either. These people are fighting for their neighborhoods, and they're showing a bravery that I'm honestly not sure I'd be capable of. I'm in awe of the Ukrainians, and I wish more than anything that our country had let their president sign whatever trade deal they wanted in 2014, because maybe they wouldn't have to be creating an assembly line of backyard bombs right now had we left them alone. My heart aches for the Ukrainians, and all I want in this is for them to have peace in their neighborhoods as fast as possible. Which brings me back to why I created this episode. I only see two paths that lead to the end of the war. One path is that a deal is made with Russia to stop the war. But for this path to work, it will require negotiations and a compromise with Russia as soon as possible. And then there's the other path, which is that one side wins after vast destruction and death inside of Ukraine, a country that again has simply been a victim of the economic battles of the elites. And Ukraine doesn't deserve that. They didn't deserve our coup orchestration in 2014. You know, these people deserve to choose their own future and their own economic partnerships, and they deserve to be safe in their homes. The least horrific path to get Ukrainians back to a place where they were safe in their own homes is the path with negotiations. You know, since we've already decided as a country not to send our military, because I'm recording this on a Saturday, it's already Saturday night here. And while I'm seeing coverage of protests that are happening all over the United States and Europe to declare, Putin bad, there are not airplanes overflowing with troops who are going to Ukraine to fight. And there are not airplanes overflowing with volunteers who are going to actually stand with Ukrainians, guns in hands, aimed at Russian tanks. We aren't actually standing with Ukraine, no matter what has been put on Instagram posts. And so, in my opinion, the least we can do is use the power of our government to try to find the compromise that can get the war to stop. And I'm not at all comforted in knowing that the coup master Joe Biden himself is the president right now. But it is what it is, and that's what I want our government to do. Which brings me back to why I just played so many clips of Vladimir Putin's speech for you, so that you can understand what he wants. And he said he wants three things. Number one, he said he wants no NATO membership for Ukraine. And this one seems like the lowest hanging of fruit. No serious observer thinks that Ukraine had any chance of becoming a part of NATO anyway. So perhaps we could consider agreeing to the thing that was reality anyway. And this is the right thing to do as far as President Zelensky of Ukraine is concerned, because he's been asking for an answer. And so we really should stop jerking the guy around. Vladimir Putin's second ask is that we get the NATO weapons off of his border. And honestly, is that unreasonable of an ask? Remember when there were Russian missiles put onto Cuba and aimed at us? Because we didn't react very well. We wouldn't accept missiles in Vancouver or Toronto or Tijuana. And so perhaps we should treat others as we want to be treated and see if maybe that strategy works a bit better than constantly flashing our big brash balls in Putin's face. And then last, Vladimir Putin's third ask was that NATO take out all of its weapons and infrastructure from about a dozen NATO countries, pretty much all of the former Soviet Union countries. And that might be a little bit too much to ask. But is it actually a crazy idea to have a buffer zone between NATO and Russia? Can we not find some kind of compromise there? And I know that negotiation and compromise doesn't feel as satisfying as... But if we actually care about Ukrainians, the people who are just like you and I, who are being killed in their own neighborhoods because of a competition between greedy, arrogant elites who use our lives as pawns in their power games, if we care about Ukrainians, if we aren't willing to physically stand with them, we should be willing to pressure our greedy, arrogant elites to stand down and negotiate in our name with some humility and understanding for a change. Now, do I think that will actually happen? Well, I don't like to predict the future, but it doesn't look good. Because right now, a bipartisan mix of the most powerful people in Congress are writing a bill that will send more money and weapons to Ukraine. Now, I don't know the details yet because it's being written behind closed doors, as all important bills that should be the most carefully considered have been lately. But they are trying to pass that bill during the last week of February. And I'm recording this on February 26th. And so things are moving fast in a militaristic, just throw more weapons at the Ukrainians who will do the actual fighting kind of way. On top of that, the government still hasn't been funded yet for 2022, which I know is crazy since we are 5 months into the fiscal year, but that's how broken our Congress is. And the new deadline for funding the government is March 11th, which means that is a very promising opportunity for all kinds of dingleberries to make their way into law. And we know that the weapons manufacturers have lobbyists creeping all over Capitol Hill. But what I promise you is that I will read whatever becomes law and I will keep you posted on what our government decides to do. And unfortunately, that's about all I can do. I feel very powerless in this situation, as I'm sure you do too. And I'm also feeling a very heavy weight of shame from knowing, to the extent that I do, the role Biden and Newland and others who were back in power had in the 2014 coup that set this whole damn chain of events in motion. We not only didn't punish those people, we gave them more power. And the Ukrainians are paying for our ignorance of our own affairs with their lives. It's not fair. And my heart and my sincerest apologies go out to all of the Ukrainian people. I hope we can somehow play a role that will help end this for them as soon as is actually possible. But until then, I just want to thank you for taking the time to listen to this episode despite any discomfort that it gave you. You know, I know it probably feels really dirty listening to Vladimir Putin right now and trying to understand him through any justified anger that you might be feeling. Trust me, I've been a boiling pot of sleepless rage for the last few days while creating this episode. I don't enjoy this at all. But the personal risk of emotional and financial blowback for me feels like the least that I can do to help the situation. Because we can't reason with an adversary that we don't understand. And I truly believe that the Congressional Dish audience is capable of handling this information, that the corporate media just does not think that you either want to or can handle hearing for yourself. You know, airing clips of Vladimir Putin doesn't generate a lot of clicks right now, and the advertisers certainly wouldn't like it. The advertisers like Putin bad. They don't like what I just did. But you have proven time and time again that you are not only capable of handling nuance, but you're actively seeking it out. I love that you aren't just political tribalists who are incapable of examining issues from the other side's point of view, which is why, despite my fears of reactionary outbursts in my direction and financial firings, I'm airing this episode right now. And if you support this decision, and if you appreciate not being treated like a fucking child, and instead treated like a mature adult who can handle hearing the words of Vladimir Putin without your head exploding, please support this show. There's a reason you haven't heard this information anywhere else. It's extremely uncomfortable to air information like this. In fact, I'm having heart palpitations right now, and I only get those when I'm really, really anxious. In fact, I'll probably cry when I publish this episode, just like I did when I published the Mueller report episode and both of the episodes about Trump's impeachment. But I promised you that I would give you the information that I find important. And I think hearing from him is important. And it's not easy, man. The easy thing to do is to join the Rage Fest. The easy thing to do is scream, Putin bad! Because everybody agrees with that. I agree with that. But I don't know. I guess I just respect you more than that. And so thank you for understanding my intentions with this episode. Thank you for listening to me and to Pooty Poots. And thank you for supporting the show. I appreciate you more than ever in times like these. Before I wrap this up, I would like to thank our new executive producer. This person would like to remain anonymous, but they are going to be an executive producer on episode 156, which was an episode about sanctions, quite appropriate. Sanctions that were on Russia, North Korea, and Iran. For those of you who are not in the know, this is a listener-supported podcast, which means that all I ask is that you pay for the show whatever you think is fair, because I don't accept advertising money and I never will because I can't produce episodes like this if I did. So yeah, that's how this operates. And if you provide a cumulative $535 to the podcast, every time you do that, you get to be an executive producer on the episode of your choice, whatever episode you feel the most proud to produce. And so our anonymous executive producer was very proud of the sanctions episode. And I think that is a very timely episode to get an executive producer on. The executive producer request also came with a message, and the message says, quote, "With the insanity going on in Ukraine, it is critical for more Americans to better understand the 2014 coup in Ukraine and the U.S. involvement. I urge everyone listening to Congressional Dish to go to Joe Rogan's podcast at joerogan.com and under the contact tab, ask Matt Staggs to book Jennifer Briney as a guest immediately to bring valid and specific information not heard on mainstream media to his audience. As your listeners know, there are a few people who can talk about the backstory and connect the dots to our government like you can for 2 hours or more. And this is the topic you need to get out to the country. Thank you." Well, isn't that a timely message? And I like that suggestion. I have actually been fired by a few people lately because I said publicly that I like Joe Rogan, and I still like Joe Rogan. I'd still like to meet Joe Rogan. And so if you are going to take this advice and go on joerogan.com and tell him you'd like to see me as a guest, you might want to drop in there that I will be living in Austin from April 20th, 420, kind of easy to remember. But from 420 to 520, I'm going to be living in Austin. So I won't have to travel far. But yeah, we'll see if that ever happens. That would be so cool. But yeah, thanks for the suggestion. Thank you for the executive producer credit. I'm happy to share the credit for that episode with you, my friend. And yeah, if you support the show, please go to congressionaldish.com. That's where you can find the show notes, which give you the sources for all of this stuff that I told you about in this episode and all episodes, and also all the donation methods. All right, I haven't really slept in 5 days, and so Joe is on his way out to get us a Portuguese pizza, and I'm probably going to keep watching Ukraine footage. I can't really stop. But I am going to stop working for a little while. So yeah, again, thanks for listening. I appreciate you guys so much, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.
We're surrounded now by liars coming at us through our TV screens.
We don't have a domestic spying program.
They're content to fight in black and white despite of any in-betweens. We got a president who plays with the facts. And then he waves a flag to cover his tracks. As if a lie is alright, if the end will justify the means. Now we are so damn tired of being lied to.
The polar ice caps aren't going away.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it lies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. We are so damn tired of being lied to.
Government jobs consume the profits of the private sector.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. Now we're not keeping quiet.
These bills represent common sense, bipartisan solutions that actually solve problems.